Fantasy books and movies are filled with dueling wizards. There's a tabletop RPG that actually captures these types of encounters. Today, I'm going to be talking about the mighty spell duel mechanic found in Goodman Games' Dungeon Crawl Classics. Now on How to RPG. Before I go into the mechanics of the spell duel itself, it's important to give you a little bit background of Dungeon Crawl Classics and some of the mechanics that go into the actual spell duel, or some prerequisites. So Dungeon Crawl Classics was released in 2011 as a beta and is heavily influenced by Appendix N. If you're not familiar with Appendix N, you can find that in the back of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. It's a list of primarily novels and authors that were very influential in Gary Gygax's creation of Dungeons & Dragons. If you'd like to know more about the authors and those works, I would recommend checking out the Appendix N podcast. Some friends of mine run it, and it's really good. They have guests on to talk about those books. We'll put a link down below to the Appendix N podcast, as well as a link to where you can find Dungeon Crawl Classics. What makes Dungeon Crawl Classics unique within the tabletop fantasy genre is that it takes a lot of the old school feel and brings some modern mechanics to the table. So there's things like race as class. So there's elf, halfling, and dwarf, as well as human, and then under those human classes would be fighter, wizard, just to name a couple. You start out typically as a 0-level commoner. You may be a beet farmer, and your only primary weapon is your shovel. You start out in maybe a village, and things aren't going that well, and the only way to make a better life is for you to venture out and score a big load of gold. But you can't do it by yourself, so typically you'll have anywhere between 4 and 8 other player characters, and it's not uncommon for one player to play up to 4 0-level commoners in their first adventure. And their first adventure is typically referred to as the funnel. It's a funnel because, well, things are dangerous. You're starting out with 1 to 4 hit points, and, casualties and fatalities are high. But if you come out on the other end and you score that load of gold, well, that's when you level up to first level. And then you actually become, I would say, a full-fledged player character. Only in the fact that you will be able to choose your class if you're human, but if you're elf, dwarf, or halfling, well, then your class is already spoken for you. Everything in Dungeon Crawl Classics is wondrous, perilous. You may start out in the village, like I mentioned, but anything beyond the dark woods is unknown, unmapped. Nobody ventures past that. So the world is very grandiose as long as it's referred to past that border that nobody goes beyond. Monsters in Dungeon Crawl Classics you can find in the back of the rulebook, so a monster manual isn't necessarily needed. But what's unique about the monsters in Dungeon Crawl Classics is that it gives a lot of latitude to the game master to create their own, which essentially brings back that wonderment as well as unknown. You can implement your standard trolls, orcs, goblins, hobgoblins, and many of us are very familiar with the vulnerabilities and the level and the challenges that they bring to the table, but they're also very, very familiar and routine sometimes. And so with a game master that creates something out of their own imagination, it really keeps the player characters on their toes. It makes them question what they're facing. What is its vulnerabilities? How tough is it? Are we going to die? And then there's the magic. Magic is powerful but unpredictable in Dungeon Crawl Classics. In some popular tabletop fantasy role-playing games, you'll roll a die to see if you hit your opponent, and then when you do, you roll damage dice, and that damage is subtracted from your opponent's hit points. So the latter piece of that is very similar to Dungeon Crawl Classics. They use hit points. But the way things are resolved with a spell are a little bit different. In Dungeon Crawl Classics, the wizard makes a spell check. That consists of rolling a d20, adding their intelligence modifier, and then also their caster level. The result is their spell check. Each spell in the rulebook has a particular table. You take that spell check number and cross-reference it through that table, and you'll find out the overall effectiveness of that spell. While in D&D, if you cast the magic missile, it does 1d4 plus 1 points of damage. Pretty static. But if you use the same spell in Dungeon Crawl Classics and you're successful in hitting your opponent, you roll the spell check, as I mentioned, and then you compare the results to the table. And the table for Magic Missile ranges from 1 to 32 plus. And if you roll a 32 plus, the caster throws 3d4 plus 2 missiles that each do damage equal to 1d10 plus the caster level. And there's much more description to that in the rulebook. But you can see how the magic and its effectiveness is really, really amped up in Dungeon Crawl Classics. It's something that you typically don't find in a lot of other fantasy RPGs. It's truly awesome. I mentioned the spell check, but there's also a corresponding difficulty class. So if you do not exceed the DC to get your spell off, you actually can lose the spell. That difficulty class is 10 plus double the actual spell level. So if you're casting a first level spell, you times that by 2 and add it to 10, you get 12. So your DC for casting a first level spell in DCC is 12. If you're casting a second level spell, then your DC is 14. Going into the spell duel, if you do not meet or exceed that difficulty class, then you could lose the spell. In Dungeon Crawl Classics, there's also fumble rules and criticals. If you roll a 1 on your spell check, it is not a good thing. In the table, according to Magic Missile, if you roll a 1 on your spell check, lost, failure, and worse. You roll a 1d6, modified by any luck, because DCC does have a luck attribute. On a 0 or less, you incur corruption plus patron taint plus a misfire. On a 1 to 2, you just get corrupted. On a 3, patron taint or corruption if no patron. And then 4 or greater, it's simply a misfire. I'm not going to go into corruption, but let's just tell you, it's not good. All right. I think we've gone over enough of with Dungeon Crawl Classics and the spell check and the difficulty class to start getting into actual mechanics of the spell duel. So let's do that. Typically, spell duels come into play in a combat encounter. During that combat encounter, of course, you're going to have the party roll initiative. For this example, we're going to have 2 spellcasters, both of which are wizards. One will be the opponent and one will be the player character. Combat encounter is going to take place. You as the game master calls for initiative. The first winner, the highest roll, goes to a fighter. The second highest goes to the NPC wizard. The third highest goes to another player character, we'll say the thief. And then the fourth, or the lowest, would be the player character's wizard. Fighter goes, takes their action. Now it is the NPC wizard's turn, or the evil wizard, we'll call him. The evil wizard is going to cast a spell. Seeing that they're going to do this, the person in the 4th initiative slot, the player character playing the wizard, says, hey, I want to go and conduct a spell duel. By doing that, they automatically get moved up into the initiative and get to act immediately. Note, as a spell duel takes place, the actions are simultaneously happening. So it is possible that if something goes awry, that both wizards will subsequently die. So it isn't a NPC gets to go first and then subsequently the player character in this instance. Every action goes and takes place at the same time. Once the player character has indicated they want to go ahead and spell duel or counterspell is essentially what they're doing against the evil wizard. Both will put a momentum tracker in front of them. The book recommends a d20 and setting that d20 to the number 10. And as things progress, that'll be increasing. Now that we have the momentum tracker in front of each of the wizards, the first attacker chooses their spell, and then the subsequent player character wizard chooses their counterspell. Since the NPC evil wizard is first in initiative, they get to choose their spell. Essentially, the player character, because they can see that they're casting this spell, they're essentially being bumped up in the initiative order in order to cast a counterspell. In so doing, one says, hey, I'm going to cast Fireball. The other one says, I'm going to cast Fireball, which is something I wouldn't recommend. It is possible, but the results could be catastrophic for other player characters in the specific area. Most of the times what you're doing is, say the attacker is casting Magic Missile and you're wanting to defend against that, so you cast Magic Shield. Now what you need to do is have each person participating in the spell duel roll a spell check. The one that rolls the highest wins. Then that winner increases their momentum die by 1. This is where things start to get a little bit into the weeds, and I think most people get lost when we hit this point of the spell duel. Now, we have the results of 2 spell checks. The evil wizard and the player character wizard. You will take the results and cross-reference these in Table 4-5 located on page 100. By cross-reference these 2 results will get you a die type. In this case, we'll say that the evil wizard rolled a 16 and the player character rolled a 13. In the table, a d5 is noted. Another thing I failed to mention is that Dungeon Crawl Classics has what's called the die chain. So there's a lot of different die types that it uses, to include D3, D5, D7, D20. There's a lot of different dice. So if it seems like I'm saying something by mistake, I'm not. There's an actual D5 and DCC. Now that you have the die type, which in this case is a D5, you will add the differences in momentum to the result of the roll. So in this instance, because we have the evil wizard has 1 momentum and the player character has 0, the difference is 1. So in this case, we'll roll the D5 plus 1. The result of the D5 plus 1 is then cross-referenced on Table 4-6 located on page 101 of the DCC rulebook. This will give the attacker or the defender a little bit more of an oomph when it comes to the spell duel. So in this case, we will roll a 3 on the D5, add our 1, resulting in a 4. Cross-referencing the 4 in that table, and we say that the attacker was high because they won the spell check, it says overwhelm. Attacker's spell takes effect and defender's spell is canceled. Now that we know that the battle between the wizards, that the player character's spell has been canceled. So then what we do is we take the spell check from the evil wizard, cross-reference that result in the table for the specific spell, and then we resolve the spell's effects as normal. And then after that, you revert back to normal initiative. Now, there's going to be other things that you're going to have questions about regarding the spell duel, but we covered it pretty succinctly to make it as easy as possible for you to navigate. There's going to be other instances where you're going to ask, well, can there be multiple spell duelers, right? Can you have 3 wizards and 2 wizards and a cleric? And the answer is yes, and you would handle it in a similar manner. So you could have 2 player character wizards battling 1 evil wizard, and that would make things super fun. One thing I also wanted to note was that if you do tie your spell checks, you are risking dealing with some craziness that could occur. It's powers beyond this world. Essentially, what happens is you would roll on table 4-7 in the rulebook on page 103. And then there's a table. You roll a 1d10, and it tells you what the results are. And typically, they're not good. Just imagine a void opening under your feet, and a rip in time-space continuum appears, and your soul gets sucked into that void, and you are instantly turned into billions of molecules of fine dust. Okay, maybe it's not exactly like that, but both wizards or the party being annihilated is certainly possible. Just don't tie. Whatever you do. Trust me. And that's it. That's the spell duel for Dungeon Crawl Classics. I hope you had enjoyed it. If you did and you found this helpful, please do me a favor and go ahead and subscribe. And if you also want to like this video, that would be greatly appreciated as well. Comments are welcome. I would be interested to know how you have performed a spell duel and what craziness occurred. Leave a comment down below. And thanks. We'll see you on the next one.